So yeah, my name is James Hocken. So I'm currently a performance analyst at Florida State University. Um, in my past, I've worked with Colchester United, Norwich City Academy, and then the FA, and then I came up into Florida. Um, my role kind of revolves around using data and video to kind of break down and find some different insights about what's going on the pitch.
And brilliant. So that's a good overview. What we like to do generally is start at the start and kind of explore how people got to where they are. And I think your story has been a good one. So can you tell us about your relationship with sport just at a young age growing up? And yeah, we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I was just your typical sports fan, football fan, I guess. I kind of had an interest in all sports and particularly football, obviously, and it was something that I'd always dreamed of being involved in at some level. Never really had a clear plan of how I wanted to get into it. But then I think when I started university, I studied sports science at Essex University, and that's when things got a little bit more serious. I started to see that maybe a career in sport might be a bit more plausible, and I was never much of a player, so I made that transition to staff pretty early on, which I'm sure helped me out.
That's fair enough. I can say the same for myself. So going back before uni, what made you make that decision and do a sports course and not make? Because I think obviously I was the same. I did a sports course in college in Ireland, and I would meet a lot of people who I went to secondary school with, and they'd say I wouldn't risk doing a sports course because maybe there's not the jobs in it. Why did you make that decision? Was it a hard one, or was it quite clear?
For me, it was more of a process of elimination, right? So when I was doing my A levels, I did the sciences, I did biology, chemistry, physics, and physical education as well, and I enjoyed that. I'd always preferred the more scientific approach as opposed to like the language approach, I suppose you'd say. Like I always preferred exams that gave you a yes or no answer as opposed to something like an English exam where you could get completely different marks depending on who's grading it. I think that kind of drove me into the analysis side of things. But yeah, sports science was one that I was looking at different options in terms of degrees. I knew I wanted to go to university, and it was more of a case of I don't really want to do this, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. And sports science was the only one where I was thinking, yeah, I think that could be interesting, that would be fun. And I never really knew what I wanted to be. I thought maybe a PE teacher, or maybe even join the army at one stage. And I suppose sports science was just that kind of way of carrying on what I was vaguely interested in without having to make a real concrete decision, I guess.
Yeah. So my next question would have been, going into uni, did you think you were going to get a job from it, or was it literally something you enjoyed, so you said you'd explore that? And I suppose it was the latter.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would have obviously loved to have got a job from it, and then there's a case of, sorry, Becky. Then there's a case of, I would have liked to get a job from it, but at the same time, it was a case of, well, I'm just kind of prolonging, not really making a decision. But I was never expecting to get a job in sport. It was more of, I think this will be interesting to carry on, see how it goes, and then we'll work from there.
Yeah. Will you talk about your course a little bit then?
Yeah, so sports and exercise science, and it was very heavily on the physiological aspects of things. We did a lot of testing. They have quite a good research facility at Essex University. So we did a lot of different physical tests. I think in our first week, they got some students to be on a VO2 max test, and luckily I had some spare crutches at hand so I could fake an injury and avoid that for a little bit. But yeah, it was a lot of anatomy and that kind of things, but they also kind of introduced the different aspects of psychology, and different parts of analysis, I guess, were introduced. And then it was actually at Essex University that we had a speaker come in from my hometown team, which is Colchester United, and he was in charge of, I believe it was analysis at the time, and maybe partly with recruitment as well. He was talking about analysis, and that's when I started to consider a career in football a bit more seriously, and thought that the end goal for me would maybe become a coach. And I thought, well, I'm not a player, I'm not an ex-player, that's usually the route into coaching, so I want to maybe see if I can do something different. And I took a real interest in trying to gather all these different aspects of football in terms of trying to really understand the psychological aspects, try and understand the analytical aspects and the physical demands of players and things like that. And I suppose that kind of led me into taking these different paths that I didn't really anticipate. And analytics is one that kind of I felt like I was good at and I enjoyed, and there was a big gap for it there. So I kind of carried that on.
Yeah. And you obviously had a placement then while you were in uni.
Right.
You probably had some options to think about before that, what avenue you want to go down. So talk about that, talk about your placement, why you chose the placement you did, and what you learned from that then.
Sure. Yeah. So going into my final year of university, there was the university itself kind of advertises the nearby placements, and I'd been volunteering for Colchester United doing some data collection for their first team. That kind of gave me the foot in the door, and this position was advertised at Norwich City, which is local to my university. It was an analyst of their academy, and I remember looking through the job description and the requirements and thought maybe I'm probably a little bit underqualified. I haven't really got the experience with the software they're using, but I think I was keen enough that I got myself into an interview, and it was really a case of this might be the first big step into working in football. And it was, I wouldn't say I was ever really confident about getting it, but once I had the interview and I walked around the training ground and met some of the staff, I was really excited about it, and I think that came across. And despite not having really the requisites, the experience that they maybe desired, like some of the other people they employed that year as well, I think they were keen to see that I was willing to learn on the job, and I think that worked out pretty well. I ended up working as a academy analyst, which is my title. I was working with the under 14s, the under 15s, and helping out with the under 23s, and lucky enough to work with Jason Todd, who's now the player pathway analyst for the FA, who really taught me everything that I know to this day. He's sort of like the guru in my eyes of analysis from what I've learned, and I was really lucky that he kind of took me under his wing a little bit and encouraged me to think about some different problems and work through that. So I've got him to thank for that. But it was a great experience in terms of working at Norwich for sure. Yeah,
I remember having some conversations with yourself and Jason down in the analysis office.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a nice little hotspot, to be fair. Yeah, I remember we had some good conversations for sure. It was exciting.
Yeah, he's a great guy. So you touched on your time in Colchester as well. What were the differences between Colchester and Norwich City Academy then?
Sure. So with Colchester, it was a lot more. I worked from home mainly. It was a case of just helping out the first team analyst there in terms of he wanted to collect some data on individual players. So he'd send me the footage from their first team games, and I'd work and collect that data myself. And the resources were available to them that was able to sort of trickle down to me weren't as much as what I had at Norwich. So I kind of had to be a little bit creative in terms of how I collected the data and used different apps to kind of help me speed up the process. And I think that's eventually what got me the position at Norwich, was sort of talking to that and sort of using the resources we have available. And Norwich was a completely different experience in that I was fully immersed full time in the professional football environment, which was completely new to me. I got to see how the relationships between the different disciplines of staff worked and how the day-to-day goes, and it was just a really exciting time for me. That's where I really knew that this is where I wanted to work long time.
Yeah, I think it makes or breaks you, because it's full on.
Yeah, definitely.
So obviously Colchester, it was first team you were working with. Norwich was predominantly the academy and 23s a little bit, which obviously feeds the first team. But if you had a preference, which would you prefer to work in? Is it a case of you'd rather work with first teams because at the end of the day the result is what motivates you as such, or do you get more out of maybe helping players develop?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good one, and that's one that I remember having the conversation with Jason Todd about, and he always favoured the academy side. He preferred the development side of things. He liked to see how players progress, and you have examples from Norwich Academy. You've got the Mercy twins, you've got Todd Cantwell coming up recently. You've got plenty of players that have come through that academy, and he's sort of been able to sort of track their progress from a young age and see. And I completely get that side of it. Me personally, I think I prefer the first team environment. And maybe that's just because I have less experience of that. And I guess it depends on where you're working. If it's a case of you're going into a first team where they don't really have a lot of access or had previous access to analysis, then I think you're able to offer a lot more insights that maybe affect the results on the pitch. Whereas if you're going into a top elite first level team, then maybe the academy route is more beneficial to you and more rewarding to you, because that's where more of your sort of rewards come out of. You see more impact from what you're doing in the academy setup.
Yeah. And then just going back to the academy setup, can you talk about some of your, almost like your average week or your average day in your academy? What would your tasks have been? And you can go into as much detail here as you like.
Sure. So yeah, with Norwich, it was a case of we did a lot of breaking down video and data collection. We did everything in-house, as there's not really too much available at the academy levels. And although that can kind of seem like a pain at first, it gives you a lot of freedom to be able to, you're not really locked to what your data provider collects. You can really chop and change and be creative, and that's something that we use to our advantage. I remember we'd have every week, we'd sit down, Jason would encourage us to bring in a research paper, and we talk through it and see how we can incorporate new and upcoming metrics and see if they'd be beneficial to us, and see if we can collect them ourselves and really be on the pioneering edge as much as we could. So we would collect some more advanced things. Jason would always try and be on the front end of that. So we would do a lot of video breakdown for the coaches with live code games, just breaking them down into the relevant categories. And then we'd go into the data collection, which is where you're looking at individual players and all the different actions they complete in terms of all their passes and dribbles and out of possession tackles and interceptions, that kind of thing. And we'd actually break them down into the zones that they happened. And that's quite a lot when you're coding it yourself and when you're doing it for a number of different academy teams. So me, myself, I would do it for under 14s and 15s and help out with the 23s. And when they're all playing one game a week, that can be a lot of your time spent. And then the time we had spare would be trying to research and innovate, I guess, and trying to improve our process.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a lot of time in front of a screen, and
sure,
even from when I was there with you, you would have spent a lot of hours in the office coding, breaking clips down, maybe making video clips to show to teams. Does it get difficult? Like it was probably 35 hours a week in front of a screen. Does it ever become a challenge?
Sure. There's moments where you're thinking it's kind of, it can be a little bit of a struggle at times to keep yourself motivated. But anytime I had just an inkling of that, I just take a step back and think that I'm watching football. The job is watching football game. You're in no position to complain. Like if you don't want to do it, you can go work somewhere else. But there's 100 people who'd be in a line to do your job. So yeah, anytime you're thinking about, this is a bit painful, or it's a bit of the same thing again and again, you're just watching football. That's all you're doing. So,
yeah, how much can you complain?
Exactly.
So moving on from Norwich, then, can you talk about your next steps?
Sure. So I completed my placement at Norwich and went back to University of Essex to complete my final year. And I wouldn't say I was as much looking for work at the time, because I could only work part-time because I was still studying. And it was all in-person classes, but I was fortunate enough that Jason Todd went to the FA, and he was really kind in offering me the opportunity to work with the under-15s there, who I think before then had only introduced England players into the setup from under-16s onwards, and they made the decision to include it from an under-15 age, which means sort of a new influx of staff. And I suppose I worked on a consultant basis to help out collect data for the different talent ID camps that we had at the under-15 age groups. It was only sort of a one camp deal. I worked with them in July through August, and then I came back in October and December and February, and then we had our international tournament in Italy, which I was able to attend. So I ended up staying for a full year. And that was incredible. That for me was really eye-opening to work with really the best, not just coaches, the best of all disciplines in the country. You had specialists in psychology, in education, in sports science. And for me, it was a case of trying to, I suppose I kind of interviewed them all. I took them aside and I was like, I know I'm kind of young here, and this might seem like this is all just your job for me. But for me, this is like so huge to be able to share time with you guys, and I want to make the most of that. And I kind of sat them down and tried to pick their brains as much as I could. So going forward, I tried to retain a little bit of knowledge from each of them, hopefully use that in any future career.
And will you break down your roles again when you were in camp with the team? What exactly were you required to do?
Sure. So I was given a little bit of flexibility in this role, actually, which surprised me. I was introduced before we had any of the camps. They did a lot of meetings, and it was extremely well prepared. Everything was down to the T in terms of anything the boys from the first minute the boys stepped foot in camp to the minute they left. Everything was perfectly planned out, and all the different interactions with the staff, the different activities, everything was planned out. So it was really cool to be introduced to this kind of setup where everything was so detailed and so professional. And my introduction was sitting down with the coaches and talking about the philosophy of the England team and what they're looking at in a recruitment perspective for these young players coming in. And they laid out the key elements of their philosophy and kind of talked about how I could perhaps record that in an objective manner. So that was my role, was to collect data for all of the training sessions and the exhibition games. We played mainly international. We played against Belgium and Holland that year. And it was a case of trying to put together reports on these players that objectively quantified how well they performed to the philosophy. And of course, that was one aspect of the meetings that we had post-camp, where we're looking at reviewing the different players. And I'd maybe say a little bit about a player from an analytical perspective. You'd have the perspectives of the sports scientists and the psychologists and the different coaches. And that was incredible to see how all these disciplines work together and really covered every single base. And it was, despite it being kind of everyone's subjective opinion, it really brought together this huge objective plan that just covered all bases, really. And it was great to be part of that, for sure.
Yeah, it sounds like a dream. Like, that's obviously my age group now, and to have that kind of resources will be.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I know. I was looking around sometimes thinking, this is crazy. These kids don't know how good they've got it, but I mean, it's England, you know. It's the best. So
yeah, absolutely. Well, it has to be.
Yeah.
So moving on from that then, and you would have came to the end of your final year in uni.
Sorry, say that again?
Moving on from that, you would have came to the end of your final year in uni. And
yeah, that's right.
What happened then?
Yeah, so that was an interesting one where I graduated, and it was really a case of I thought about, all right, now's the time where I kind of pick a career to stick at, and I'm looking for now a long-term job, where I always kind of had a little bit of the philosophy when I was working in football. I wanted to make sure that while I had no ties, I had no girlfriend at the time, I had no house, I didn't even have a car, I had no ties to any location. I wanted to make sure that I could just bounce around as much as I can, learn from as many different coaches, different playing styles, different types of players, different age groups. That was my idea, was to spend maybe a year at a different place. And that's what I did with Colchester United, then Norwich, then England. And then the idea was to maybe spend another couple of years bouncing around, just carrying on learning, until I got to the point where I felt I was comfortable enough to settle into a job and be able to do a job with the appropriate education. And my next plan was to just find a job that fitted that next kind of something a little bit different to what I'd already done. And there's a position advertised for a performance analyst with Florida State University in America, which was, I suppose, as different as it could be. So this was working with women's team as well. And for me, I never knew anything about American college sports. It was a completely alien idea to me. I knew nothing about it. I knew Florida State I'd never even heard of. I think I'd heard of maybe Harvard and a few other different colleges in America, but I had no idea the scope of college sports over here until I actually came over. So it was a pretty quick turnaround after I graduated. I applied for the job, and I think maybe 5 weeks later, I was in America starting preseason with them. And the resources here are just incredible. Florida State's an American football school. The stadium's like the size of Wembley. Is ridiculous. Honestly, it's unbelievable. And I came here and I looked around the facilities and the changing rooms and the field, and it's just incredible to see. And I was like, okay, I was a little bit apprehensive about coming here. I was like, I could be walking into anything. But and the coaches here, top level, all the staff available. You've got the same kind of resources that I was used to at England, with the different disciplines and everyone sort of coming together. And to me, this was the first time that I'd been in a situation where I was to sort of set up the department. They'd never had an analyst previously, so it was my role to kind of come in, set up, speak to the coaches about the philosophy, and figure out how we can measure it and how we can influence results directly. Whereas all my previous roles had really been more development based, and this is the first time it was really winning over development. So that was really cool. And it's 2.5 years later, and I'm just about still here. So.
Just about. Yeah, we'll go into that a little bit more in a second on how your role has changed going over. Just as I said to you before we started, a lot of people in Ireland wouldn't really have much of an idea about the college system in America, and I put myself in that bracket. Can you give everyone a kind of insight into how the competition works? And like, it's obviously such a big country.
Yeah.
What are you competing for? Are you competing for to be the best team in America? Is it states, regions? What is it?
Yeah. So I need to be a bit careful not to completely butcher this, because it still confuses me at times. But the way that soccer is, and as I understand it, is pretty similar for most of the sports. Assuming that the universities compete in those sports, they all compete in a conference, which is more region-based. I think there's 5 sort of big power conferences, you'd say, and they're kind of all based on the different regions of America. So here at Florida State, we compete in the ACC. Compete in schools against like North Carolina, Duke, and some of these big schools. And you play sort of a league, a season. It's called the regular season, and it's kind of like a league table. Even though it's kind of irrelevant where you finish, because the bigger picture is all about the end of season NCAA competition. So obviously the regular season is important, making sure you get a good seed in the tournament, and there's a little conference tournament in the end where you have the best teams of that conference play each other and who's the winner of the ACC. But then it really goes into the NCAA, which is the whole of the college field. It's all of the best schools in America competing for one title, which is, as you said, the best team in America basically for that sport. And that's the national championship. That's the big one that everyone competes for. That's the end goal for every big school. And that was something completely foreign to me as well, as I'm kind of thinking we're playing all of these league games, and it's all about really the current form going into the end of the season. It's almost just like the playoffs and the championships and the League 1 and 2 and below. It's that kind of format where there's no automatic promotion. It's just going into the final, trying to win the final tournament, as opposed to just being the best over the entire season, which is a little bit different, but is very exciting. And I think they kind of base that a lot of their other American sports, your basketballs and your American footballs, and they kind of follow that system. So it's a little bit different, but it's definitely very more exciting. Yeah.
And again, forgive me for the ignorance. So does it matter at all where you finish in that first kind of conference, or is it you have to be in the top half to qualify for the latter stages? Or
sure. Yeah, there's some relevance to where you finish. So 2018 was probably our most successful season, and we finished, I can't actually remember where we finished in the regular season of 2018. I believe we finished sort of 4th or 5th place. I'm not entirely sure. That seems bad. I don't know, but we didn't have our best season in terms of the regular season. But once we got into the ACC tournament, we stormed through the tournament. We won the ACC tournament, and we had a number 1 seed going into the NCAA tournament, and we ended up winning the whole national championship. So again, it matters in terms of getting a good seed and putting you in good stead for the rest of the tournament. But I'd say we finished as number 1 in the country that year. We were the best team in America, despite not winning our little region conference. So again, it's interesting. It's a lot different to back home. It's something that I have to really wrap my head around, but it's definitely very exciting.
And then is there, with that in mind, do coaches, I suppose, almost prepare the team to peak at that stage of the season then?
Definitely. There's definitely aspects to that. Yeah. I suppose it's a very tight schedule as well. We're playing 2 games a week usually, from sort of the end of August through to the start of December is when the final is. So it's a tight turnaround of games, and you need to be smart about not completely overworking your players. You need to be wary of recovery, and that's another thing where the resources are really playing into. We use Whoop, which is like a wristband that all the players use, and it tracks the quality of sleep and quantity of sleep, and gives you an idea of not just that, it's like a Fitbit souped up completely, and it gives you an idea of where they're at in their recovery. It gives you if they're in the red, orange or green zone, and lets you know how hard they're allowed to work in training, and all these different aspects, and everything's recorded, everything's super objective, and they're very smart about it. There's a lot of detail that goes into it, because there's really little room for error when you've got this kind of tight turnaround of games.
Yeah. And how much do they train then if they're playing so often?
Yeah, we're still training every day, bar the game days. We'll have rest days thrown in there and they're very, very carefully planned, in terms of, we have excellent sports science staff here who really know what they're doing. I was surprised at the level of detail that they're working at, in terms of that, and they plan very carefully the intensities and the durations of every training session we have throughout the season, and when those when those types of training sessions occur, and when the rest days are, and how many rest days they get. It's all perfectly planned, keeping everyone in the same fitness cycle as well. But it's very hectic. It's basically the same as a professional first team in England. It's the same kind of schedule.
Yeah, I've so many questions about it. So obviously all the players are students of the college.
Yes, they're student athletes. That's right. Yeah.
And is there then a requirement to perform at a certain level in their studies to play?
Yep, 100%. And that's something that the coaches here really pride themselves on. Again, I'm not 100% sure of this, but I believe the most recent average GPA for the team was 3.7, which is out of 4. It's very, very good. And that's something that they have someone who's kind of oversees their education and helps them understand what their requirements are, and they get tutoring, and they're very, if you're not paying attention in class, if you're missing class, if you're slipping up with your grades, you're going to get called out for it. It's not a case of you're just here to play soccer. You're here to get education as well, and making sure you get the best education possible, for sure.
And would there ever be situations where someone's average has dropped quite low, and are they not allowed to play? What happens if it's
Yeah. I'm sure there's plenty of scenarios like that where there's difficulties, but I know for a fact that the way these coaches recruit here specifically, they lay out the expectations very clearly. There is little room for error, and the players know that going in. And I haven't seen any occurrence where the players are willing to risk that, because I think it's got to the point where I haven't even seen them disappoint the coaches, really, because they know they'll get called out if they do.
Yeah, brilliant. So recruitment then, how does that go about? Because like I've heard stories of Irish kids going over to American colleges. So how do they know what players to recruit? There's obviously such a big market, and well,
sure, and as well, it's tough. There's very strict rules and regulations about recruitment. It's only really the coaches who are allowed to do any of the recruiting. There's certain periods where you're allowed to contact players and when you're not allowed to contact players, and different age groups you're allowed to contact and things like that. In terms of recruitment, again, it depends on the level of the school, and we're at Florida State going to be looking for the better kids overall. I think the coaches here have a good reputation of doing well internationally recruiting. It's an interesting one. On the men's side, it doesn't work out too well because the way that the college system is set up over here, it's kind of like they're preparing kids. It's like in American sports overall, the kids, they go to college because that's the step. That's the step that gets them into the draft, and that gets them into the professional leagues. And that works. It works with sports that America has a monopoly on. So it works with your American football and your basketball because kids know if they want to get into the NBA or the NFL, they have to go through that college route. Whereas in soccer, in football, it's a case of, right, if you're a really good 15, 16-year-old male, say, for example, you don't need to go through college to get picked for the MLS. You can just go to Europe. You can go to anywhere to play and get paid well. So the system is not broken, but it doesn't work as effective. In women's soccer, it works a bit better because I think America definitely is the best in terms of women's soccer and the pro leagues. That's slightly changing now. I think it's starting to pop up more in Europe, and France is a good one. There's different Scandinavian countries that are popping up that are quite popular with women's soccer, so it's changing. Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's one that's continuously developing.
Yeah. And then we talk about your role.
Sure. So yeah, as I said, when I first got here, I was sort of the first analyst to work here, and that kind of involved me trying to figure out my role. It was almost like I arrived and they were like, all right, do your thing. It was me kind of used to coming into a role and being expected to be told what's expected of me and my roles and requirements and things like that. Whereas this was so much freedom. And I think that was huge for me to be able to really decide what's important, what I think will benefit the team the most and what will benefit the players the most. And yeah, I think I've done a good balance. My focus has really been on trying to integrate data and video. I think that's key when you've got coaches and players that haven't really worked with a lot of data before, is to make it extremely accessible by using it with the video at all times. So my focus really in the last two and a half years has been to build all of our sort of visualizations and our data reports. We build them into Sports Code, which is our analysis software that allows us to connect everything you'd want to see visually with the video. That means that it can be used as a coaching tool for the players as well.
I suppose you're allowed to focus on that more because I think I've seen you speak recently on LinkedIn actually. The coaches do a lot of their own video, do they?
That's right. The coaches are very heavy on video here, and that was one of the things that surprised me coming over here. Was all of the coaches use Sports Code. They all do their own clipping. They straight after the game, they're into the video room and they're breaking down the video. We've set it up so we put the game on the projector, and you've got the defensive coach on the iPad, and he'll be collecting his defending clips for the players and the team. And you've got the attacking coach on the laptop doing the same thing on the attacking principles. And they're doing that straight after the game's finished. They're watching the game through. Once that game's finished, they'll go into their offices and clean the clips, ready to show the players and the teams the next morning. Meanwhile, myself and one of the other analysts will be breaking down the individual aspects of the game, and we'll have that all ready, everyone's parts ready by the next morning, hopefully. So the players can come in the next morning after the game, they can sit down, they can have their team review, and all the clips are shown on the team basis. They go then individually for their one-to-one meetings with the attacking coach and then the defending coach, and they can sit down, they can see the data reports with the video, and they can see the specific tactical clips. So it's extremely data heavy, and that's something that I think is so valuable, and the coaches see the value in that, and that's very refreshing to see.
That sounds really good. I might be wrong, but is that something unique to America? I don't know. Again, it might be individual to certain clubs. I don't know, are clubs in England working in that kind of manner?
Sure. Yeah. I don't want to generalize too much, but I think there's definitely I think there's more of it in America, and I think that comes with again, the way they kind of link it to their other sports. You look at American football and basketball and all these different sports that are so not only video heavy, but data heavy. I think that really helps the transition. And I think without the other sports using it so heavily, I don't think they would have even looked for my position. I think, yeah, they kind of look to the basketballs and the American footballs and other sports to see what they're doing, what makes them teams successful. Let's see how we can try and translate that into football. And yeah, they're on top of that. It's different where a lot of the coaches in England are coaches because they've played at a high level. That's usually a requirement for academies and their audits as well, is for coaches to have previous playing experience, and that tends to lead to a lot of coaches being ex-players. Whereas over here, they're more, a lot of them are college graduates. They're ones, I don't want to say more educated, but they have that more of a scientific education as opposed to just playing experience. And I think that does tend to lead to a slight different approach in terms of how they analyze games. It's not so much of this is how we did it in our day and this is how other teams are doing it around us. It's more of a, right, let's see what the most up-to-date recent research is saying and see how we can try and implement that. So I think that's an exciting field for the analytical perspective in America for sure.
Yeah. I want to get your view on some of the new metrics that are coming out, because if you're someone who solely follows the League of Ireland, I think this season is the first time we've seen expected goals, and that's about
right.
That's about as far as it goes.
Yeah.
I think the league in Ireland is quite far behind England. So if you were just following an Irish team and the Irish league, you wouldn't really know a whole lot about data. You would only be maybe starting to see the beginning of it. Would you talk about a few metrics that have interested you, particularly over the last few years and maybe even going forwards?
Sure, yeah. Expected goals is the obvious one. That's the kind of go-to for the analyst. I mean, I think that's the easiest one to kind of get an immediate impact in terms of you walk into a team who's never had analysis before. You talk about, not so much you talk about expected goals, but you talk about the implications of expected goals. You talk about being efficient with shot selection. You talk about these different aspects that surround the sort of expected goals. We use expected goals as a base metric to look at other metrics. One of the key ones, if you're looking at shot selection, for example, you look at expected goals per shot, which just tells you what the average player, what a player averagely takes for their shots. Are they taking too many bad shots, too many good shots? There's no such thing as too many good shots, but that's the idea. Is you're looking at if a player's average shot is only 3 or 4%, then it's maybe worth sitting down with them in a room and having a look at some video and talking through some of the different options available and talking about these different efficiencies when it comes to decision making. I think going forward, there's definitely some new exciting metrics, and a lot of it revolves around possession value models. And I think Liverpool came out recently and kind of talked quite openly about what they're doing with their recruitment strategy in terms of attributing every action it has on the pitch with your percentage change in terms of what's your likelihood of scoring. I think that's one of the big ones going forward. You've got Karen Singh, who's an analyst, who's come out with a metric called expected threat, which is very similar. Kind of talks about not so much what's your chance of scoring from this particular location, what's your chance of scoring from the next 5 actions from this particular location, then who's getting into those real danger zones. So it's not just about what's the most dangerous shooting locations, but the most dangerous locations overall. When you have data that has all these locations, you can start to look at, right, who's actually moving the ball into the right areas and who's maybe not. And it just gives you, I suppose, more accountability. I think going forward as well, it's just about adding context. It's nice to see all these different metrics come out, but to be able to break it up in terms of how players are acting when they're building versus when they're in the final phase of attack. In transition, I think is a huge one where you really should be analysing transitional moments completely separate to how you analyse moments when you're building or in the final phase of attack. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. But for me, I suppose the biggest thing right now looking forward is just adding context to these different actions and trying to break them up into things that are a bit more easier to get your head around.
Yeah, and I suppose talk about the football world in general then. I've read a lot of stuff online about obviously Liverpool's success, and I think they're, from what I've read, one of the forerunners on the analytical side, and they've hired some very interesting people. Do you see football completely going in that direction in the next, or even how long do you see that kind of?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to. I mean, you look at the success that Liverpool have had and the amount of money they've spent to achieve that success. If that's not asking questions from other clubs saying how have they done that, then they're not going to be successful, you know. And I'm not saying that analytics is the answer to it, but it's definitely a cog in the whole system. I think you look at Liverpool, and they've definitely gone to the extreme where they've got Ian Graham, who's heading up the research department, and they've got physicists from America, from Harvard, I believe, or I'm not entirely sure where they're from, but they've got some real top people working there, and they're looking very heavily at the data. And not just that, they're implying a lot of different approaches. They're thinking outside the box. Where you look at the throwing coach they employed, they've got a lot of different aspects that they're kind of bringing all together. And I think clubs will start to look at that and see the success that they've had and try and replicate it in some way. And I think that will lead to a bit more of a boom in analytics. I think it's already been happening over the last 10 years, but I think it will definitely start to grow even further. Yeah.
Brilliant. Last few to close then. So you can't do a Zoom nowadays without talking about obviously the current situation. How has your role changed with the COVID-19 outbreak, and what's your day to day like?
Yeah, it's been an interesting one. I was originally intending to graduate and leave Florida State in May, and due to sort of visa complications, they can be kind of strict in terms of you want to make sure you're employed in a certain amount of time after you leave your current position. And with this whole thing going on, Florida State were kind enough to allow me to stick around a bit longer, give me that opportunity to work another season, and then maybe look for a new position after that. And now it's just a case of, right, we're starting to look at the season coming back, and hopefully it will go back as normal. Up until this point, it's been a lot of learning from home and using video as a coaching tool to try and break down and teach these different aspects. So this would normally be our spring season, which is dedicated to training, and obviously without that, we have to kind of think outside the box a little bit and do a lot of different videos, and there's only so much you can do. But for me personally, it's just been a lot of home learning and trying to figure out some different things that I wouldn't normally have the time to work around in season.
Yeah. And then the very last one, and I'm interested in the answer. So when your next year is up, what's your plan? Is it another move for experience, or are you really looking to nail down maybe something in a quite competitive league? What's your
Yeah, I'm still thinking it over, but I think my next step is definitely going to be in the looking at more of a permanent position. I think I've kind of bounced around a lot of different places now. I've worked with a large variety of coaches and players and different genders, not only age groups but genders now. I've tried to experiment as much as I can, and I think it's time to try and put that to good use in a more permanent way. And yeah, I'll be looking for probably a club level position. But again, due to this current climate, you just got to wait and see what's available, I guess.
Yeah. Is there any country you have your eye on? Would you like to go back home, or?
Yeah, no, I'm completely open to that. I think no, I'd never been outside of Europe before I came here, so it's been great here. I've really enjoyed it, and it's kind of opened my eyes to the different possibilities in any country. I'm not ruling anything out. I'd love to carry on working outside of England. I think I'd always like to go back there eventually. But until then, while I'm young, I'll try and travel around as much as I can and see some different things for sure.
Brilliant. Well, I'm really interested to see how the next year and 5 years and 20 years go, and I'll be tracking it along the way, and I'll be expecting good things, great things. So I
appreciate that, Jason. Thank you.
Thanks a million for coming on. I think everyone that listens will take a lot from it. It's the last two interviews we've done have been with League of Ireland players, so this is a little bit off track, but really and really different as well. So thanks a million for taking your time and coming.
No, thank you for having me.
No problem. And we might catch up with you in a year's time when you've made that move.
Yeah, sounds good. I look forward to it.